Welcome to the Worship Lounge, and this is a special series of the Worship Lounge, which is an opportunity to celebrate our associate clergy. And today we're celebrating the Reverend Dr. Fran Toy. Welcome, Fran.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about your call to ordained ministry.
Well, whenever I hear someone say, when Fran decided to become a priest, I get a little annoyed. Or if someone asks me, and when did you decide you wanted to be a priest? I would say, no, I did not decide. In fact, I struggled mightily because I have to go back to the beginning. I was only 17. I was a junior in high school, and something very interesting happened to me. And I heard a message, and it said, "God has special plans for you." And I'm thinking, what? I'm an Asian female raised very traditionally, where I would defer to other people, where I was very self-effacing. So to hear the word special, it was like, this cannot be happening. I had a mother who would say to me when I brought home a report card full of straight A's, "Now, if you think you're smart, there are lots of other people smarter than you are." Or if somebody compliments the way I look, she would, when we got home, say, "Now, if you think you're pretty, there are plenty of other people prettier than you." So to hear somebody say to me, "God has special plans for you," I found that very difficult to believe. My sister, who was 2 years older, suggested I call the seminary. So I did. I dialed CDSP, and they put me in touch with St. Margaret's House instantly. St. Margaret's House was the institution on the West Coast which trained women to become lay professionals for the Episcopal Church and women to be deaconesses. And I was asked if I intended going to college. And I said, yes. And this person asked, "And what do you think you're going to be?" And I said, "Well, growing up, my sister was always going to be the teacher. I was always going to be the nurse. So it's either going to be teaching or nursing." And she said, "Great, just great. After you graduate, call us again because we do have St. Margaret's House right there in Berkeley, close to Cal." So I put everything out of my mind and off I went to college. And again, my mother, she never said to her children, "if you go to college." It was always, "when you get to Cal." So my sister and I did get to Cal. And my mother also said, "You may not marry until you finish college." So I graduated in June of 56 and married in August of 56. And because during my freshman year, I ended up in the hospital with asthmatic bronchitis. My parents hovered over me at Cowell Hospital and said, "No, you may not go into nursing. Obviously, you've picked up something from being in the hospital." I was going to be the nurse. So when I was 14, I volunteered at the Veterans Hospital on 13th Street and worked there. And then I became a candy striper at Children's Hospital. And when my parents said, "No, you may not go into nursing," I went into teaching. So I married, as I was telling you, and I married in 1956, right out of college, had children in 59 and 61. And when Tammy was born, I stayed home for the next 7 years being a full-time homemaker. And all this time, I was raised as an Episcopalian. I am a cradle Episcopalian, and I felt very fulfilled as a lay woman. I did everything that I wanted to do at the church. I even was the first female senior warden at that time. Our Savior was 68 years old, so 1974, I was the first female senior warden at Our Savior, and life was fine. I was teaching, and in 1977, over Lincoln and Washington's birthday, I was attending a gathering of Episcopal Asian Americans. And at that time, I was enrolled at USF in their master's program in education. And as usual, I was very behind in magazine reading, so I had taken a pile of educational magazines with me. So here I was on a rainy Saturday in Issaquah, outside of Seattle, Washington, minding my own business and reading the magazines when suddenly I heard a voice. And this time the voice said, "Where have you been all these years? I've been waiting for you." I looked around and there was no one in that room. And I was so overwhelmed and bewildered. I didn't mention this to my rector for some months. And finally, one day I screwed up my courage and said, "Victor, guess what happened to me while I was reading a magazine at Issaquah?" And I said, "I heard this voice." And he and I had a little discussion. And he asked, how do you feel about being ordained?" And I said, "How do I feel about being ordained? Never have given it a thought." And he sent me to chat with 3 priests, 2 males and 1 a female, and they were all very affirming that I did indeed have a call to be ordained. And then I paid a lot of money and went to this place in Oakland called the Center for Ministry and went through a whole batch of tests. And then I had my interview with the person who was the director, and he said for him, whether or not a person would be called to be ordained would be whether or not he would feel comfortable coming to that person if he were to be under some kind of a crisis. And he said he certainly felt that way about me. Now, I didn't put all this together until years later, that I had this sudden call early 1977. And in January of 1977 was the first time that the Episcopal Church legally ordained women to the priesthood. So it's very interesting how God has, just rained down upon me grace upon grace. Things have just sort of happened to help me along on this path. Because in 1977, I was not ready to be ordained. I wasn't accepting this as a call to ordained ministry at all. But it happened also in 1977 that the teacher with whom I shared a classroom at Hillcrest Elementary School asked me about job sharing. She had never taken time off in spite of having 2 children, whereas I had been home for 7 full years. And so after chatting with Art and with the family, I did agree and I started job sharing. Now, this gave me some time to really think and pray and talk with people and go to the Center for Ministry, and all the time saying to God, "No, this can't be happening. You can't be asking me to upset my whole life." I mean, there's that saying that you make plans and God laughs. Well, I had always planned that I would teach until I was 55, and by that time, my 2 children would be out of college, and then I would retire, and Art and I would sit in front of our fireplace and grow old gracefully. Well, I know God had a big laugh because all the while I was on my knees praying, thinking, reflecting, saying, no, no, no. There, finally, it took me 2 years. In 79, I said, okay, all right, I will start the process. And if the Commission on Ministry at their spring screening conference says no, that will be it. Well, they didn't say no. So then the next thing was seminary. Wow, I was going to continue teaching and go to seminary simultaneously because by that time I would have 2 children in college, and those were the years of double-digit inflation. But because I was doing job sharing, I looked at the CDSB catalog of classes and I just took anything that was consistently given every Tuesday and Thursday. And we were on the quarter system at that time. So for
You
3 years.
had
Go
yeah.
ahead.
So you, in all of this inner evolution and questioning and so forth, that's one side of your story, but and it seemed like there was a fair amount of support with you in all of that, but there's a difference between the idea, I suppose, of a woman in leadership, and then the reality of having a woman in leadership. And I've heard many amazing stories about some of the challenges after you were ordained. Can you speak a little bit about what that was like?
Oh, yes. I think I shared at one small group meeting at St. John's that when I was wrestling with my call, uh, the rector said to me, now, Fran, you know you've already struck out. And I'm thinking, what? And he says, yes, strike one, you're female and not male. Strike two, you're a person of color and not white. Strike three, you're older and not younger. And he was right. I mean, going through the Commission on Ministry and the Standing Committee and all the interviews, I realized it was a cross-cultural experience, but I don't think that the members of the Commission on Ministry realized that. And I first came up against uh, the racism part, and it was unintentional on their part, I know, but I was asked at the interview for the diaconate to tell them who my favorite theologian was and why. Now remember, I have several split seconds to think about an answer. And this was racing through my mind. Oh, my favorite theologian would be James Cone, who wrote out of being oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, oh, but if I say that, they're going to throw me out because I appear angry and I'm saying I've been oppressed in the church. Oh, no, no, that won't do. So I dredged up some Northern European male. And then the next question was, okay, and tell us why that's your most favorite theologian. Of course, I couldn't tell. And the interview went from bad to worse. And they actually voted to postpone my ordination to the diaconate for 6 months. They suggested I take more theology and then, go back to the commission again. And I remember one of the professors at CDSB saying, oh, he said, that's wicked. That's wicked. Fran, you passed all 7 areas of your GOEs, and that includes theology. But the bishop said to the commission, I know her better than any of you. And I've had 5 days of Ember Day letters from her. So I'm going to send her on to the standing committee anyway, and we'll see what they have to say. But the next day when I went to the standing committee, they smiled at me and told me that I would be ordained in June. But I took more theology anyway. And the following year, when I went up for my interview, for priesthood, at the end of it, I was asked, well, do you have any questions for us? You know, or any comments? And I remember saying, last year you asked me who my favorite theologian was, and this year you didn't. But had you asked me, I would have told you I am my own favorite theologian. Now they liked that response. Well, that was 1985. In 1986, I was told by the bishop to interview for a position to be chaplain at the Cathedral School for Boys. Now, I had interviewed once before I graduated in 1984, and I thought that was a grace-filled day. I was there on March 19th, the feast for remembering St. Joseph. What a wonderful day to be chatting in chapel about St. Joseph to the Cathedral School for Boys. Well, the headmaster at the time said to me he would hire me, but he was leaving, and there was a new headmaster coming on board, and he couldn't hire me. He needed the new headmaster to make that decision. Well, the new headmaster came on board, and I interviewed with him, and he said that he would hire me, but he was new, and he had a lot of battles, probably, and he didn't want to hire the first female chaplain for the school. But anyway, in 1986, the bishop asked me to apply again. And he always felt that I would be a good candidate because of my teaching background and then my theological education, having graduated from seminary. Well, he took me for a walk during the spring clergy conference, and he said, I'm sorry, Fran, to tell you, but sexism and racism are alive and well in the Diocese of California. And I thought, what? Why are you saying this? Well, apparently, the bishop went to the board meeting for the Cathedral School for Boys, and he was there as my personal advocate. But when the discussion was going on and there was a decision to be made, he said he heard all kinds of strange comments. And finally, he heard this comment, oh, but she's so short.
Hmm.
And he knew that they were not going to hire me.
Wow, those it's quite a story there, and yet you really are an historical figure, being the first Asian woman ordained in the Episcopal Church, and you have meant so much to so many.
Well, yes, go ahead.
Through a lot of racism and sexism, and it seems like you've been so effective at breaking through it.
Well, I needed to try. As the first, when I served at on different committees, it's strange but true how people look at me, and they think that when I open my mouth, I'm speaking on behalf of all women or all Asian women, and of course that's not true. And but I had to work very hard to do a good job at whatever I was supposed to be doing. When I spoke with the bishop upon graduation from seminary and asked about my future, he said, I see you as the vicar of St. Swithin's in the Swamp. Now that's not saying a lot. Anyway, I started off when no one would call me, but I ended up doing interim ministry. My first position was at True Sunshine, San Francisco, the other Chinese-speaking congregation, and the bishop said, that they needed an interim, and they looked through the whole clergy directory, and I was um, available, and I was bilingual, bicultural. So I was to interview, and I interviewed, and then they did call me. And from True Sunshine, I went to Christchurch, Alameda, and from Christchurch, Alameda, I went to Resurrection, Pleasant Hill. And then at this point, the bishop went off on sabbatical, but he had a chat with me, and he said, "It's my understanding that you will continue in parish ministry because you're very effective, especially as an interim." So off he went, and I sat at home, and I didn't think that any of the parishes and missions in the diocese would call me as an interim. But along came a job opening for a very, very part-time position at CDSP for the first funded alum coordinator. So I applied there. I was interviewed and I was called. And when the bishop came back from a sabbatical and found me at CDSP, he was very annoyed with me. He said, "I thought we had this understanding that you would stay in parish ministry." And I said, "Yes, but," and then I held up my fingers and I said, and I named all the congregations. And I asked him, "Now, Bill, do you think any of those congregations would call me a Chinese female?" So anyway, he knew, he understood that for reasons of several isms, I was not going to be called by any one of those 7 congregations. Anyway, so there I was at CDSP. I started out as a very, very part-time person as alum coordinator, and then I slowly added more hours, and finally in the fall of 1990, became the full-time coordinator. But at that time, CDSP called a new dean and president. And what he did was, to save money, he asked me to do more than a full-time position. I did part of it with alums and deployment, and the other part I was dean of students. And I didn't have the title of alum coordinator and dean of students, but he made up this wonderful long title of director of alumni, and student affairs. So that's what happened. And I ended up doing lots of deployment. I found out that deployment was wonderful. It was like being a marriage broker, putting together people and places. And I was very, not flattered, but very, very encouraged when I was recognized as being a good deployment officer, and even bishops would call me up to ask me for recommendations. And I was asked to serve on the National Church's Board of Deployment. And I asked when I was invited to join the board, I said, "Why Fran Toy?" And the answer was, "We need somebody on the West Coast. That's you. We need someone ordained. That's you. We need a woman, and that's you. But most of all, we've never had on the National Deployment Board someone who did deployment at a seminary."
Mm.
And of course, being the first Asian American female priest, I've been first at so many things. I mean, the diocese elected me in 1988 as the first female a deputy to General Convention. And of course, I was first to go to provincial meetings. I've been first for quite a few things, including being elected to the Executive Council of the National Church. It's all been
So
very challenging. Yes.
Yes. And, we still live in a time with severe racism,
Mm-hmm.
severe sexism,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Ageism.
and ageism. And what is your advice to those of us on both sides of it? I'm a privileged white male. I seemingly have an easy path that was laid out for me, culturally speaking, and but uh, how how do you advise, especially women of color? Have you had opportunity to encourage them through this frustrating, um, you know, power struggle? And if you want to look at it, people not wanting to give up their power or feeling like it should only go to certain people, or leadership only applies to certain types of people. Um,
It hasn't been easy. One avenue that I have used is through the Episcopal Asia America ministry meetings. And when the women finally convinced the person who sat at the Asian desk at the church center that the women needed to have a convocation of its own and gather as women, I was very gratified to know that they elected me as the first convener of the women's convocation. And so that meant every time that EAM met, the women met as a body. And that's where I did a lot of leadership training with the women. And it was challenging and daunting because realizing that just like me, women raised as in a very traditional Asian way, learned never to speak up and to be very self-effacing. And here I'm saying to them, you know, we are already rendered invisible by society at large. We must not further render ourselves even more invisible by not standing up and saying something that's important and always remembering that power shared is power multiplied.
mm. Well, that's a wonderful message. And as I have one more question before we have to close our time together. We are so fortunate that you came to St. John's after your so-called retirement. Of course, you've been active continually. But what drew you to St. John's?
Ah, I was so delighted that Gray Catherall was part of our cottage meeting group. And I did tell some of the members as we were finishing up that he is the reason that I'm at St. John's. I taught his children at Hillcrest School. And one day we were sitting there having a parent teacher conference. And I have no idea how the fact that I was an Episcopalian came into that conversation. It's a parent teacher conference. We're not supposed to be talking about our beliefs much. We're talking about the child's progress and how to be helpful as parents and how what I'm doing at school is helpful. But anyway, Gray, Catherine, and I somehow got to the subject of being an Episcopalian, and he said, "Oh," he asked, "where do you live?" And I said, "Well, a little bit down from the Mormon temple." He said, "Aha, that means that you can get on Highway 13, get off at Thornhill Drive, come to our 6:30 Wednesday morning Eucharist, and then get back on the freeway and get to Hillcrest to teach."
Hmm.
And so that's how I started. And when Rob McCann, the rector at the time, saw me and asked me who I was and what I was doing. And I said, yes, my name is Fran Toy and I teach at Hillcrest School, but I'm also an Episcopalian. And I happen to be a seminarian at CDSP. And, you know, and this this last May 18th was the 40th anniversary when Mount St. Helens blew. And that Sunday, 40 years ago, May 18th, was the first time that I ever attended a Sunday service at St. John's. And how well I remember that. And I remember that we were having service and we were all sitting outside. Service was outside. So when Rob asked me to be the seminarian at St. John's, I thought, oh, that's very convenient for me because it's close to home. And I said yes. And that's how I ended up at St. John's. And then, of course, years after I retired, we had been at at Our Savior in Chinatown, but it got very difficult to find a parking place. And as Art became more fragile, I couldn't ask him to walk several blocks to church, especially when it was pouring rain. And so I started thinking about a church closer to home. And of course, St. John's was right there. It's really geographically my parish church, and it has a parking lot right there. So that's how Art and I returned to St. John's.
Well, we are so blessed to have you.
It's a blessing for me to be there, friend. It
Well,
was for Art, please.
we miss Art so much. And he was, in your story, so supportive of you through
Absolutely.
times when you weren't being supported, sometimes by the church itself and the leadership within the church. And so you continue to be a blessing to us, and we are grateful for you. And I thank you so much for taking this time to share a part of your story, and hope you've enjoyed it as well.
I have. Thank you for the privilege of being interviewed.
I'm sure we'll do it again. Now that we've entered this new realm of providing interviews online, there's a lot more story. There's more stories to tell, and we look forward to those. So thank you, Fran.
You're very welcome. Bye, Scott.
Bye now.